Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And we've just been to see Project Hail Mary.
Yes.
Sci-fi adventure comedy based on a novel written by Andy Weir, who you may have heard of because he also wrote the novel The Martian, which the film The Martian was based on. And he has a kind of funny reputation because his novels, I think he's written 4. Those 2 have been very successful. And they're seen as, kind of a return to hard sci-fi that like really takes scientific literacy and accuracy very seriously. So, that kind of translated in the film The Martian into stuff about, growing your own ecosystem when you were stuck on Mars in order to, like that. It all felt very real, right? But also people find his books quite cringy, the way they're written. I've read bits and pieces of them and I kind of see what they mean.
Why? Why are they cringy?
I think people say he's not that great at dialogue and kind of human relationships, which maybe speaks to why, The Martian in particular, being as successful as it was, is about a guy who's stranded, can't speak to anybody. People see him as kind of quote-unquote a Reddit author. Sort of, it's all about the science and the details and getting it right. I think you can almost see that a little bit in the end of this film, where I love this film. I had such a good time. But I think it really wants to tell you about everything that happened at the end. I think the pacing kind of drops in the last, it's sort of the epilogue, because it's telling you a lot of extra bits. Yes. And I feel like there's another way it could have ended that might have been smoother and neater and that kind of thing. We'll get to it. But I wonder whether that might be something that speaks to that kind of detail-oriented. And another thing. Oh, here's another thing. I mean, that's how I speak, right? Like, I get that. But I think it's maybe not the best way to make a movie.
Because I'm not into that at all. I mean, I don't really care. But I didn't mind that at all.
Yeah.
Though, my first impression of it was what a pleasure it was to be in a cinema where the image itself was so luminous, that you felt a richness of light and color, and that every image was thought through, that it was interesting to look at and composed and, kind of, beautiful.
You saw this in the Birmingham IMAX Digital.
Yes.
As we see as many films there as we can.
Yeah. So, kind of that was just wonderful to experience.
Yeah.
So I like that aspect kind of very much. It's a film that must be seen at the cinemas. Actually, at the cinema, I actually kind of dread to think what people watching it on a regular TV, much less a laptop or a phone, will make of it, because a lot of the pleasure in it was just sitting in front of those images in that light.
Yeah. It's wonderful visually, and there's some real breathtaking moments, I think.
Yeah, it's beautifully designed, and it's beautifully shot and kind of complexly shot with kind of, really interesting kind of movements of light in the image.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's definitely been made by people who are interested in the image and the quality of the image. And I was just reading that, although it was shot digitally, the whole film was transferred to film and then redigitized because they wanted to capture the kind of warmth that analog film gives you. Right? You can feel it, I think.
You could feel it, yes.
So the film is directed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, who we were just discussing. These guys were like really hot property 10 to 15 years ago. They made Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 1 and 2, which were really imaginative, silly, wacky, stupid kids movies. Wonderful. Loads of good jokes. They directed the 2 Jump Street films.
Yes.
Same thing. Loads of imagination in those things.
Yes.
They directed the Lego Movie. And the Lego Movie in particular was so interesting because they, before you get to the kind of the story it was telling and everything, they had this basis of this is stop motion kind of with Lego, but they had to make it look as realistic as they possibly could. And there are things like speed lines, like kind of blurs in that film aren't in-camera blurs. They're like long pieces of Lego designed to imitate blurs. There's all this detail in what they're doing. They really care about the image that they're creating.
Yes.
Right? And I think this speaks to that as well. So this is the first one they've directed in 12 years. They've produced things in between, including the Spider-Verse films, which have a similar, kind of visual imagination and enthusiasm going on.
2 things that you brought up that interest me. One was that it has the same source material, The Martian, because that was a one-man show. Really, it was Matt Damon. Yeah, and this feels like pretty much a one-man show, which kind of surprised me because when you see all the publicity for it, which, I mean, I haven't been following, but you can't avoid it, like on YouTube, right? There are interviews with, it's always Ryan Gosling and Sandra Huller.
Right.
And I thought she would have a much bigger role. Yeah, she's got a significant role. Yeah, it's a pivotal role in the film. But actually, it's kind of a small role. The film is really all about him and the interaction with the extraterrestrial.
Yeah, with Rocky, as he names him. The small amount of publicity I'd seen had been like something where Ryan Gosling was doing like a long throw in a baseball game or some fucking, I don't know what it was. And the idea was it was a Hail Mary pass, and then it was Project Hail Mary, go and see Project Hail Mary. That's all I saw, right? So I didn't know anything about the story. And so I came to only knowing it was Andy Weir as the writer of the source material. And it seemed to be about a guy in space, kind of stranded, needing to do something quite unlikely. And I was like, okay, that is just the Martian again. Right? That's what the Martian was. He was stuck on Mars and had to get home. This has its similarities, but it's about a guy who goes to space on a very long mission, 11 and a half light years from Earth, in order to understand why stars are dying. And we have this thing about a biological organism, just a cell, of which there's a huge population, that is eating stars. It feeds on the light from stars. They find a way they can use this to propel a ship. That gets him all the way there. In coma, he wakes up, finds he's the only one of his crew remaining, and he has no memory. But when he gets to where he is, he sees a different ship, a really weird alien-looking ship, and eventually makes contact with the sole inhabitants of this ship, which is a small, four-legged, faceless rock creature that he calls Rocky, and learns how to communicate with it, and it becomes a friendship between the two.
My initial thought about that is, what a terrible design of the monster, so to speak, And then I changed my mind, really.
It grew on you?
Yeah, I grew on me.
Yeah. I mean, it's supposed to, I guess, it's got kind of puppy-like qualities, and it really reminds me, in fact, this goes back to the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, when you get the computerized voice that Ryan Gosling ultimately gives it, really reminds me of the character Steve from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. So that was about an inventor, and one of the things this inventor invents is a monkey thought translator, and he has a pet monkey, and all it does, the monkey just goes Steve all the time, and it was voiced by Neil Patrick Harris, which wasn't really necessary because they didn't say very much, but it would go like Steve and hungry, 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 and stuff like this. And this is like there's a lot of the same kind of comedy going on in the way this voice works.
Well, I mean, the comedy is what I like least.
Oh, really?
Though I know that it's just me because, you and Jen were laughing throughout and found everything funny. And
I found it really charming. I thought it hit all the right notes.
I thought it was kind of adolescent, cheap humor. A little bit like 21 Jump Street, actually. Like, it has that kind of humor, right?
There's a little bit of puerility.
I liked it much more in 21 Jump Street because, that adolescent thing was part of the plot.
When you say adolescent, are you talking about puerility?
Yeah.
Because there was a joke about fist my bump, because he doesn't understand what fist bump means, and then that sounds weird to us. And I suppose there was the way it feeds, which is basically shoving its hand up its arse, so it looks like. That was...
Well, I mean, I think so many of the interactions, between Ryan Gosling, they were meant to be jokes. They're funny. You laughed. Yeah. I just didn't find it funny.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I didn't mind it. Like, I didn't find it offensive or, but, it was definitely not my type of humor, really.
That's fair enough. But I would say adolescent isn't quite the word I would associate with it. But it's quite...
Well,
it's
not
quite daft.
very sophisticated jokes.
It's probably not that sophisticated. It's quite daft. There's a little bit of slapstick. It's very silly. So it's very kind of... I think it probably plays very well to a young audience. And when I say young, I just don't mean teenagers. I mean, like, kids. I think they'd love the interactions between...
Yes, I mean,
Gosling and Rocky.
When I went to the loo after the screening, and there were a bunch of teenagers, maybe 17, 18, 19, and... they just think the film's a masterpiece. And it's like, which I think it is a very good film. I mean, I loved seeing it, don't get me wrong. And actually, but you see, what I loved about it, and I suppose they're my own kind of, that feed into my own concerns, is I love the way the film values intelligence and learning and education. Yeah, and kind of, how that prepares you to problem solve in life, and in tasks, but also in human interactions. Yeah, the whole thing about communicating ideas or teaching ideas or conveying ideas is part of the key that allows him to communicate with an alien.
Yeah, I remember you saying something similar about The Martian.
Yeah.
Although there wasn't the problem with communicating. There was a problem with communicating back with Earth, and they had to figure that out, but not with learning a new language. But you were saying the same thing, right? This is a film about someone who uses their brain to solve their problems, and it has kind of like a tactility in the way it does that. You really feel how he's thinking through a problem and solving it, kind of moment by moment.
Yes, and I also like it in a way. So another of, I suppose, my maybe prejudices. Actually, I don't know, but I think there's a way in which our society has sexualized everything to such an extent that it makes the idea of love between men, well, it's just evaporated from our culture, right? Like there are no longer any discussions of that. And yet historically that has been kind of very much a part of every culture. Yeah, that you have like these profound relationships between men, that are affective, that are about feeling and sharing and so on, but, are not sexual, right? And now we live in a culture where it's inconceivable. You're always suspicious if it's, if that relationship is so deep, there must be something beyond it that they're not telling, right? Yeah. And I think this film, in a way, it is kind of a romance between two different species, but that they're both in a way gendered as male, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just about to say this because you say romance between men, and at no point did it ever occur to me that Rocky was not being coded even lightly as male, but the only thing we think he's given the name Rocky by Ryan Gosling, calls him that, but he has no idea of gender at that point. He's a rock character. Then Rocky's partner is Adrian, which he names the planet. He talks about Rocky's mate. So that's that gives you a sense of one is male and one is female, but we don't actually speak about Rocky said. It's not given to us. We're not told. And yet it never occurred to me that Rocky wasn't male. You know what I mean?
Well, I think because his whole way of behaving or interacting and so on was so male.
Yeah, like a boisterous when he gets
and
into
also
the ship.
Like the sharing, it was like a kind of a boy's sense of humor and the technological geekdom, the way that they're interacting. You're so bossy and you're so messy. And it was all coded in ways that I understood to be male.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think
and what you have is a love story between...
Yeah, I mean, I cried.
Yeah,
deep, like a lot.
I was moved. Yeah.
Did you cry?
No.
Okay, so I'm better than you.
You're more sentimental.
I cry. I mean, it seems like I think the film basically doesn't have an original bone in its body. It is a cobbled together from other ideas and films we've seen before and just tropes, But it's the way that the way that Pixar has always worked. Like, from the first scene how everything's going to shake out in those films, but it's about the way it shakes out. It's about how you see it. It's about the way it plays out, and that's how it works here. It's like I didn't need this to be breaking new ground in all sorts of ways.
Well, it doesn't,
and it told a really beautifully told story, very sweetly. I had a niggle with it here or there, but it's just about the relationship, and then you really feel it.
I mean, I think I would put it in a different way, but similar, in the sense. I mean, for me, I agree that it's not a very original film, right? And I don't think it's a very complex film, and yet it's kind of one of the most satisfying experiences I've had at the movies in the last year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And partly because I said, the luminosity, the light, the design, it looks so beautiful, and at the center of it, it has this great charismatic movie star performance, by Ryan Gosling, who doesn't put a foot wrong. No. Right. He's wonderful at all these double takes. He does the physical humor great. Yeah. And kind of, he makes even what I take to be banal jokes. Yeah, and he does something with them that obviously is kind of, the audience laughs at. Yeah, they work. People.
And he's also, when the film has to sell its dramatic story beats, he does that too. And so, you get this difference between the present day, where we're in space trying to work out where we are and how we're going to solve problems, and back on Earth, where he was the scientist he was a school teacher, a kind of quote-unquote disgraced or ignored scientist who become a middle school science teacher who gets embroiled in this problem that we're having of the stars are dying, we need to work this out. To the point where he winds up on an aircraft carrier, having to live there with all the other scientists and all the other people running this mission, to the point where he gets sent into space, and it's not entirely of his will. Not at all of his will. And, you know, when we're getting to the points where he is being kidnapped, essentially, and put into a forced coma and sent on a ship with no... I mean, I thought that did occur to me as original. Maybe it's been somewhere before, but, you know, what you get with characters who've gone to space in fiction is they might regret it once they're there. You know, you'll have the story point where it all seems like a failure. I regret it. I miss my family, blah, blah, blah. But I don't remember seeing people who, you know, or at least a main character who was sent into space against his will because it was for the good of the people. That's interesting.
Yes, I thought that was interesting.
You know.
And actually, that's also kind of part of the feel-good aspect of the film. Yeah, so actually that kidnapping and drugged into risking your life also has kind of a positive spin in the sense that the character can save the world because someone believes in him more than he believes in himself. Yeah. And that adds to the kind of, I don't know, there's a social dimension to the film, of doing good for others, of collaborating, of working together, of not being afraid of strangers, right? You know, it has kind of, and that of, you know, the need of a community to kind of build confidence and belief in oneself. I thought that's kind of one of the messages that the film conveys.
Yeah.
I think I was having this random thought, which, you know, is worth exploring because I was reading about Timothée Chalamet, you know, being kind of, I don't know, an inheritor to Leonardo DiCaprio. Yeah, that kind of, you know, he's doing all these interesting films and he does all these blockbuster films. Yeah, and, you know, and he's a very good actor, and yet, you know, he's arguably the star of his generation and so on.
And won't win an Oscar till he's 45.
But I was thinking in those discussions, what's missing is Ryan Gosling. Yeah, because I think Ryan Gosling is that figure in between them. Yeah, because, you know, he's done all these great films, like, and done these amazing performances in, you know, Blue Valentine, The Place Behind the Pines. Yeah, kind
Beyond
of.
the Pines, yeah.
Yeah, Drive. You know, I mean, you know, those are all kind of like really, really interesting films with kind of really key kind of performances. And then he's also done like romantic comedies, like Crazy Stupid Love, right? And musicals, La La Land and Barbie. And yeah, it's kind of incredible range, right?
Yeah.
And also straddling, you know, that kind of auteur-driven kind of independent cinema that finds an audience with like these big budget kind of, you know, massive successes. And he is in between the ages of both, yeah.
It's interesting. Because I know what you mean, and certainly kind of within film circles, put it like that, or within kind of film enthusiasts circles, he's enormously well respected. But does he have the level of hits
I think so.
DiCaprio and now Chalamet with the likes of Juno?
Well, I mean, DiCaprio is.
I mean, everything is a hit.
DiCaprio, along with Cruise, is almost in a class of his own.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the sense that, you know, almost every film he's done has been a blockbuster success, which hasn't been true of Chalamet, right? He did a lot of indie films that were successful indie films, the way that Ryan Gosling, but that have earned a place in the culture. I mean, I think people reference The Notebook as like, their favorite film of all time or whatever. And then, you know, kind of young men will reference Drive or Blue Velvet or The Place Beyond the Pines in similar terms, right? And then, of course,
things... people talk about Blue Valentine like that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
You know, it's such an incredible film, and it means something to people.
Okay.
It wasn't like a blockbuster success, so it was an indie hit.
Sure.
But, you know, young men really identify with that. You know, this feeling of like being in love and being dumped, and it is a referent. And, you know, The Place Beyond the Pines is iconic, just his face, you know, with the tear. Right, and that was a blockbuster success, and you know people have La La Land is one of those kind of, Marmite films, but it was a huge blockbuster success with, I think, again, kind of images and scenes that almost defined cinema. Those scenes of him and Emma Stone, dancing in the sky in the Griffith Observatory. I've seen that image just used as, a way of speaking Hollywood cinema.
Yeah, yeah.
Conveying Hollywood cinema.
I wonder whether, because I hear everything that you're saying, I wonder whether there is something, this comes down to that nebulous star factor, star power thing of, there's something charismatic about DiCaprio and about Chalamet that I wonder whether there isn't quite, or not in the same way with Gosling. When you see him like interviews, you feel the kind of the stardom of Timothée Chalamet. And when you see Ryan Gosling in interviews, you feel a warmth and a sense of humour and an intelligence, but it's not quite the same thing.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Though I also get your point in the sense that I think at a certain point I would have agreed with you more than I do now. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that Barbie changed everything in his career. Right?
Yeah.
And not just his performance in the film, but actually his performance in the Academy Awards, right? And, because those things have a kind of a momentum. I think people feel a kind of warmth towards Ryan Gosling now that maybe they didn't feel when Blue Valentine came out. Yeah, that they might have respected or admired or lusted after him, because, he was used in Crazy Stupid Love as an object of desire.
Yeah.
Right? But I think, that warmth and identification and so on that kind of builds a bigger type of star. I think it's more recent with Gosling, though I think he definitely has it now.
I think he was also early on seen as quite a technical actor. I mean, I remember first hearing about him in Half Nelson, which was 2008, I think, an indie film. And
yes, I've seen that.
Everyone talked about his stillness
in
it. You could read so much into his stillness, but it's like it wasn't acting almost. He was so still, And then stillness, I think, became kind of associated with him. I mean, to the point where when he was making Blade Runner 2049, it made so much sense for him to be, an android, not android, whatever it was, replicant, kind of robot type thing that doesn't have a soul but does it, and can you see it creeping in, and which it worked amazingly well in that film, by the way. When you see
but again,
him sort of coming
but
alive.
I would disagree with that, because I think that's part of his range. Because, when you see him in The Notebook or like Blue Valentine, those are men who are crazy in love. Yeah, and they communicate everything. So there isn't that, blankness that you see in Drive more, for example.
Drive, yeah. But I think that became associated with him. And that's the reason that I think something like Barbie changed it quite significantly, which I agree with, because he was completely different, and he was like very kind of alive and wacky. And I think that's part of it is definitely wackiness. Like, I remember when I first started to become aware of him as someone with a good sense of humour and all that warmth that I described. When I saw him doing interviews, when I saw him do that interview with Alison Hammond on whatever it was, GMTV or This Morning, for Blade Runner 2049 with Harrison Ford, and Alison Hammond is just like wacky herself and just making a mess of it, and then the whole interview was a mess, and they had a very good laugh about it. And that was, and you thought, oh right, this guy's not quite the same as I thought. I also saw a really wonderful thing where he was promoting The Nice Guys, which is a comedy that he was very good in.
I don't like that film.
On Stephen Colbert's Late Show, and he was there with Russell Crowe, and he said, "Yeah, I know you're a huge fan, Stephen, of Lord of the Rings, which he famously is. So's my mum." And he read out a question, like to test Stephen Colbert's knowledge. He read out a question from his mum, and it was just this really lovely moment, because like his mum had written this note that said "be good," and he had a picture of a bee, and it's like, that's what my mum was like, And then the question was like, this thing that happens in Lord of the Rings, do you remember this thing that happens? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, what page did it happen on? And it's just this daft question, but like, you felt like I kind of don't imagine Leonardo DiCaprio doing that on a chat show. This is a different kind of person. It's a different kind of vibe of the charisma is different.
Yes,
feels much more relatable, personal. Like I think the stardom of like DiCaprio and probably Chalamet is one that is there's a degree of remove about it. This is an icon to be recognised.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, DiCaprio and Chalamet became huge stars very, very young, when they were still gangly. when they still felt like all their limbs were, they hadn't grown into their limbs yet.
Yeah.
And I think with Ryan Gosling, there's something maybe slightly different in the sense that, as far as I can tell, he never had that gangly period. He was so incredibly good looking and also traditionally good looking. Though I suppose you can say that about the others as well, though, I'm not sure. I mean, I think somebody described Chalamet as rat face. Yeah, they're like from...
And you can see it.
And you can see it, right?
Probably some opera fan. Because the backlash is happening.
Yes, possibly. I think maybe it kind of it's taken longer with Gosling to seem kind of more, I don't know, ordinary or something. I think maybe middle age agrees with him because he's got a warmth and also he's more relatable, I think.
Yeah, I think a sense of humour agrees with him, which I think is, like I say, I think that was something that wasn't something you associated with him early on, and as it developed or you grew into it, whatever the phrasing is, he became more likeable, personable, and his stardom kind of changed. And there's no question that he's a star who is driving the success of his films,
and
that's what's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, the film is inconceivable without him.
Yeah,
he is so central to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a real pleasure to watch, and I did find it kind of very affecting. Yeah, I was kind of moved by it. So this is a film with, like, at least for some people, laughs, and it's very moving, and it's really amazing to look at, right? And
it's really amazing. We should emphasise this because this is like, people talk about, people remember particularly fondly the look of Interstellar and the kind of the scale and the feeling of importance to those images. I think a lot of that is also driven by the Hans Zimmer score that goes underneath it with that organ that's referencing 2001. But that had that feeling of the vastness of space, the importance.
Has a very sophisticated use of music as well.
Yeah. Well, this is doing similar things, but it has a much more. I think it's that relatability thing again. It has a much more relatable feel to the imagery and a much more playful feel. This, although it comes from, to some degree, that world of hard sci-fi that's trying to convince you of the reality of everything. We get to the planet that they're ultimately hoping to pick up this like biological predator from, and it's pink and green, and the light shines into the ship and on their faces, and it's such beautiful, kind of evocative lighting that is not quote unquote necessary. You could make it a brown rock, and it would communicate the same. It would communicate the same story thing. It's the place we have to go to get the stuff, but it's different. It's a wonderful world that is a joy to see. When we go into Rocky's ship, ultimately, we only go in it for a tour. He says, "I'd like to see your ship," and we get to, and it's just a magical thing to look at. Like there is joy in designing that set, building that set, developing, showing you that imagery, lighting it the way it's lit. And
it is kind of, you do feel a sense of wonder in watching those images. But I want to go to something that you mentioned earlier, that about the use of green screen and how now people show off that there isn't green screen, whereas in fact there is green screen, whereas in the past, people showed off the computer-generated imagery where there wasn't that much.
Can I just mention, because we talked about this just before the podcast, so I'll say what it was, which was that in the Wikipedia article of this, I saw something that Christopher Miller, one of the directors, had said that we didn't use any green screen in this. But there is obviously visual effects used for space imagery, and even though the set was all built, there were shots of Ryan Gosling in space that used black backgrounds or similar coloured backgrounds. So, like, that's green screen. It's not maybe green, maybe it was blue sometimes, but it's green screen. And there is this thing about how, when computer technology first came in, this is when I was talking about Tron in 1982, there was a handful of computer-generated shots there, but they said, everything's computer-generated. This is the new technology. Come see this film. And these days, you have nothing's computer-generated. Everything's done for real. And, of course, there's CGI all over the place.
Well, the reason why I wanted to bring it up, though, is because I think part of the reason that the film looks as amazing as it does is because it has sets.
Yeah.
Right, because that are built and it's not computer generated, or you know, I mean, there are obviously special effects everywhere, but, you know, but there is a difference. I mean, some of those shots of Ryan Gosling, you know, that are shot behind glass, and you get a sense of three-dimensionality, and, you know, the screen that frames them is curved, and, you know, you get that is a, you know, a real physical thing in between him and the camera.
Absolutely.
And actually that's part of what helps create this very particular rich look that the film has.
It is. So I absolutely agree with you. And all I'm ridiculing is the idea that, you know, okay, we didn't use green screen, we used another kind of screen. Like, they are still using visual effects. There is this impulse to deny that visual effects have their place, you know, but they do. But I absolutely agree with you, right? Like, there's the combination. I mean, the Rocky character is puppeteered. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of shots in which he's also computer generated. Yes. You know, I mean, you can tell what those are when he's rolling around in that ball and stuff like that. He will be a CGI component, but he's puppeteered, and you feel it. And you feel the physicality.
Or when he holds the earth in his hand, and that, it kind of his glass cage. Yeah, there will be visual effects elements to those shots,
but he's puppeteered. Yeah. You know, and you feel the connection between him and the Ryan Gosling character very deeply, and I don't think that you know, I mean, like, acting against a puppet has always been kind of it's been one of those sort of marks of an actor's ability. Like, people like to say that Michael Caine, one of his greatest performances in the Muppet film, which there's an element of truth to that. I think people say it because it's sort of daft to say it as well. There's an element of truth to it, though. You know, how do you make people believe that you are feeling something in response to this puppet? You know, and this puppet has no face; it just has arms. Like, the work of the puppeteer is incredibly important as well, because he's the one who brings it to life, or he or they, I should say. You know, there's always a team of like 4 or 5 people in tandem doing these things. But the fact that it's real and not a CGI element that you're playing against is huge. Having said that, I mean, even when back in 1988, when Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out. Now, that's someone who wasn't acting against anything real. You can't puppeteer a 2D animated character. That's done after the fact. So there is also, you know, that has its own place as well, of like acting against literally nothing and trying to kind of
bring life to it.
Bring to life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't know. It's just like it's a meandering point, but the point is to be made here that the film is very clever and very wise to use sets and puppets as it does,
because it gives a very particular look to the film.
Yeah,
that I've missed, you know, because there is a sense in which so many superhero films, they actually feel a little bit lifeless because they're so computer generated that you think it doesn't have gravity. Like the films like Gravity, it just feels like cartooniness, when you know, some of those superheroes move. Not all. I mean, I love superhero films, so I'm not. This is not a knock on that. Yeah, but this film kind of has a weight, a richness that comes from the way that it's been designed. Really,
I think it's funny as well and interesting as well how the films can feel different once they're at the cinema and on your TV. I remember feeling this very much with Avatar, the first one, where in the cinema you were in the world completely. It looked incredibly real. You felt the life of it.
Yes.
And when it got onto
awesome.
It was. And when it got onto the TV screen,
it feels almost stupid.
It feels much more like the cartoon that it kind of is. I mean, it is mostly computer generated. These characters are essentially, you know, although they're based on motion capture and what have you, they're computer generated things. And I think when it's on a TV, the brightness tends to be higher because you're basically looking at a light bulb instead of a reflective screen. And I think it's the size and just the way you're watching it is. It is qualitatively different, and you feel fakeness much more than you did in the cinema.
Well, and particularly with those films that are 3D, like you don't have the same experience. It's a different type of experience. It's a different type, you know. So actually, sometimes I think when people say, "Oh, I didn't like Avatar," my feeling is, well, you didn't see it, right? Like
sometimes that's true. Yeah.
So you know, but anyway, to get back on subject. I thought this was like an amazing film. I mean, again, it's not one of those films that's going to be considered a great masterpiece of the cinema, but, you know, it's my favorite cinematic experience of the last year, I would say.
It's like an enormous audience pleaser.
Yes.
You know, I think like it hits all of those different segments that it wants to hit.
That's worth saying, because we saw it on a Wednesday at 7:30, and it was a pretty packed crowd. Yeah. Which it normally wouldn't be.
Yeah. And a responsive audience. The film's definitely had very good word of mouth.
Yes.
People have been talking about it, and that is definitely driving crowds.
Yes. And it's been a huge success so far. It's been out for 10 days, and it's made like 325 million or something.
Yeah, on a 200 million budget. So it looks like it's going to do extremely well. I think people will go back and see it twice, probably.
I think so too.
They'll go back and they'll want to see that relationship between those characters again. You know, it really reminds me of, I think probably quite deliberately, it reminds me of Flight of the Navigator. Which was, I don't know how successful Flight of the Navigator was, but it was, again, it was quite early CGI, and they were trading a lot on the computer generated imagery and the use of computer, and it looked amazing. It still looks pretty good. And it's about this kid who basically gets kind of abducted by a spaceship, and makes friends with the sort of being on board that's like the pilot or the whatever it was, and it was the wackiness of the relationship and the comedy that came out of the way they interacted and so on. And this is like this hugely reminiscent of those two characters, the way they bounce off each other, and the kind of the type of energy and the level of energy in their interactions, and then the sad part where they have to say goodbye and everything. In fact, let's get back to the ending of this, because I mentioned, you know, so what we ultimately get, and I cried like 3 times, and I mean heavily cried. Right, the film worked like
so sweet.
The film worked because when we saw Pillion, and I talked about crying.
Yes,
that was the first time I cried like that
since Toy Story.
In memory, like I definitely had before, but like I couldn't remember. And now it's happened again, and.
Well, it was very moving.
Tears were coming down my face when they said goodbye. When Rocky says he'll sacrifice 2 megatons of fuel to give to him to get back home, because I couldn't fix the problem that killed my crew, but I can fix this problem ahead of time. Really, it works on me. And this is that thing, that Pixar thing of, I know where the story will go. I know they'll do these things, and it works on me so much.
Yes.
You know, the film is selling everything to, and it's not just through, you know, kind of use of music that swells and everything, although that does happen. It is in Ryan Gosling's face, and it is in the way that those lines are delivered, even though kind of a computer voice, though it's acted. The way those lines are delivered by Rocky. And then we get to the end, and so we've had this basic story development where they've got what they need to, and they've said their goodbyes and gone their separate ways back to their home planets. And Ryan Gosling realises that Rocky is in danger, because what they've accidentally bred is an organism that will eat through his entire ship. So his decision is, do I go home or do I go back and try and save Rocky? And that's what he decides to do. And one or two more things happen with them. You know, he sends messages back to Earth and the information that they need in order to save the planet. He gets back to Rocky and he sets up on Rocky's planet, and he says, okay, we can send you home now. And he goes, I want to stay, and he ends up staying. And there's just so much going on in this segment of story that I was thinking,
the film wouldn't have lost anything if it had ended when they say goodbye.
Yeah, or like I thought, there's a version of this story that ends with them saying goodbye and not being able to see each other again, and it's a tragic thing that they've built this friendship. They're the first people who we haven't had this much backstory about them individually, really, but you know, it can be the 2 people who didn't have anyone, and now they have each other, and you know, and now they have to say goodbye. But imagine that they can still send messages to each other that'll take 20 years to get there. It should just have
ended when they said goodbye.
And so, like, Ryan Gosling in his old age gets a message back from Rocky, and that's the end. He still has his friend, even though he's about to die. You know, he was still able to send a message back. And
I don't even think you need that. That's
something like that.
You're complicating things. I should just have ended when they said goodbye. Because actually, I think everything that happens afterwards, to me, weakens it. Right? And it makes it unbelievable. So at the end, when they're living together in Adrian, you know, and they have like this kind of beautiful friendship or whatever, my thought was, okay, it's one thing to not sexualize everything, right? You know what I was saying about the relationship between. It's another thing to imagine, like, kind of, you know, Ryan Gosling kind of never having sex in his life. Like, surely he must want to go back to Earth and build a relationship with someone that he can physically be with, right? You know, I mean...
Well, it's interesting what you say about sexual... Like, that occurred to me as well. Like, he's just given up on sex his whole life, but we haven't already seen that in the rest of the film. We've heard about a previous relationship that he's had. We don't see anything about... There's this implied thing between him and the Sandra Hüller character that goes nowhere, and she betrays him, as he says, and everything. But, you know, the thing about sexualization is... You were saying it's nice to see a film that's not overly sexualized. On the other hand, there is a kind of sort of prevailing idea that Disney in particular, the kind of Disneyfication of culture, at least cinema culture, has desexualized everything. You make sex jokes, but people don't actually... There's no sex in films anymore. You know, well, this is not something that's considered part of relationships that we show on screen. We maybe imply...
If that's true, and I'm sure it is, then, you know... everything beyond that goodbye moment makes the film less satisfying to me.
That's what it did for me. I think the pacing suffered after that, and it was trying to do all this extra thing to make the story ultimately get where it needed to be.
It answers all your questions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which in a way it's good, but actually you don't need those questions answered.
It could end more poetically.
Yeah.
And less, which is like I said, which is where I ultimately come back to that idea of Andy Weir being a Reddit author. I don't know if this is the way the book ends, by the way. Like, this is highly speculative about all that kind of stuff. But just the idea that this is a film that's about ultimately answering all the questions and satisfying you and leaving nothing unexplained.
I suppose, you know, the ending where he's, you know, teaching the alien kids. It's a nice image. Yeah, you're teaching across cultures. You're teaching kind of,
You're bringing human knowledge, which they don't have.
Which they don't have. There's a sharing and tolerance and, you know. But I think the film's already done that. You know, it's already shown you that by the time they say goodbye to each other the first time around.
Yeah.
So I think all those various endings are unnecessary.
Exactly. Like, I don't have a problem with them. Like, I'm happy with the way the film ends. And it does do that satisfying thing, but... I think there is a more satisfying way and a more fitting way for it to end than the way it does.
Yeah, they could have made a more streamlined film, yeah. And actually, I didn't feel that it was long, yeah, but it's worth pointing out that it is long.
I was surprised.
I only noticed when I looked at my watch, and I left the house at 7. It's now midnight.
Plus podcast time. But yeah, it's a 2.5 hour film.
Yeah.
And... I was surprised at how long it was, and I think that's one thing that you do start to feel as those endings or that ending sequence comes into play. You know, okay, where is the story going to continue going from here? Felt like there were wrap-up points that hadn't been used. But up until then, it's got an incredible sense of pace, and it moves and it moves and it moves really beautifully. And what I really like, actually, I think this is something that's true more generally of the way that films tell their stories. Is, you know, I was thinking about the use of montage and the way that it flashes back and comes back to the present and flashes back, and then within the flashback, or even within something in the present day, it will just jump back and forth in time. This is a very common thing. This is not specific to this film. It's the way that, for instance, when they're like fixing something on the ship, let's say, you know, you'll kind of jump back to a point where they were fixing it, a point forward when they're talking about the problem that they solved. This is the way that films build these montages. And only watching it today did it occur to me that this is like a really natural thing to do. Because if you wrote it down, like if you wrote down the list of times that they're showing you, it'd be like now, 5 minutes ago, 2 hours before that, an hour after that. But like the film is kind of jumping about chronologically.
I thought it did that very elegantly.
But it's extremely, elegant, organic. You don't question it for a minute. You understand everything it's doing. And I think what occurred to me was that this is actually how people tell stories.
Yes.
Right? This is why it feels so natural, I think. Because when people tell stories, they don't speak chronologically. They don't say, this happened and this and this and this and this. They'll say, this happened, that reminds me of this. And it was when he said that. And then he comes back, and I know this guy from then. People do jump about in the way they tell stories. And we are capable of understanding that intuitively. I don't know, it just occurred to me for the first time watching this, even though it's common to so many films.
Well, yes,
that is how this kind of editing works. Just an idle thought that I had.
The last thing I just want to praise is both the score and the soundtrack, right? And, you know, the soundtrack is very eclectic. I mean, it's so unusual to see a film, you know, that has Gracias a la Vida and Gardel tangos and the Beatles, you know, and songs from, you know, the classic American songbook all melded together.
Ike Turner, I think I saw on the soundtrack.
Yeah, in a way that really just kind of made sense. And that was kind of lovely to see. So, kind of overall, a really satisfying evening at the movies.
Really, really satisfying. Very beautiful to look at. Very satisfying. Very funny, despite your particular
lack of humor.
Basically, everything worked on me in a big way. I really loved it.
Yes, I did as well. So on that note, thank you all very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, and YouTube Music. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and Blue Sky, eavesdropping.bsky.social, and Instagram, I suppose. I think we're eavesdropping at the movies on that. Now I've started to use that account.
Good.
And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.